She was standing in the kitchen holding an envelope when I came through the door. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the cold coming in behind me off Juniper Wharf Road. Not the smell of whatever she'd been cooking earlier that was still in the air. Not the particular quality of the November dark outside the window that Portland does in a way that feels personal, specific to this coast, this latitude, this time of year when the water goes gray and the light leaves early, and the cold has a weight to it that summer visitors never see. I noticed Margaret standing in the kitchen holding an envelope, and I noticed that her expression was not one I recognized from 53 years of recognizing her expressions. She is not a woman who looks uncertain. I want to establish that clearly because it matters to understanding what I was seeing. Margaret has been certain about things since the day I met her. Not arrogantly, not in the aggressive way of people who confuse certainty with correctness, but in the particular way of someone who has done their thinking before they arrive at the conversation. She comes to conclusions. She trusts them. That quality has been, across 5 decades of marriage, alternately one of the things I admire most about her, and one of the things that can make a disagreement with her feel like arguing with a completed structure. That evening she looked uncertain. I set my bag down near the door, unwound my scarf. I'd spent the afternoon at the old workshop on Commercial Street, the space I'd maintained for years after my formal retirement from maritime electrical work, where I still occasionally took repair jobs for boat owners I'd known for decades, more because I needed the work in my hands than because I needed the money. I was tired in the clean way of a day spent doing something practical. I hadn't expected to come home to whatever I was looking at. I asked, "What's wrong?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked at the envelope in her hands. Then she looked at me with an expression that I have spent many days since trying to find the right word for. It was the expression of someone who has carried something for a very long time and has finally decided that the carrying is done. She asked, "How much do you think a person can hide from someone they've been married to for 53 years? I smiled. I want to be honest about that. My first response was a smile because the question sounded, in the way she said it, with the particular dry delivery she uses when she's being philosophical, like the beginning of one of the conversations we occasionally have late in the evening when the day is finished and there's nothing left to do but say the true thing. I assumed it was rhetorical. I assumed it was the prelude to something gentle. Then I saw the second envelope on the table, and the third. I walked closer. Margaret said quietly, "I need you to promise me you won't call anyone until you've heard the whole story." I looked at the envelopes, then at her. "Why would I call anyone?" She lowered her eyes. "Because you're going to think I betrayed you." The word landed differently than most words do. Betrayed is not a word Margaret uses lightly. She has precise language. She always has. It comes from decades of administrative work where words needed to mean what they said, and when she chooses a word, it carries the weight she intends. I picked up the first envelope. Inside was not what I expected. Not a bill, not a bank document, not anything from the categories of official correspondence that an envelope on a kitchen table usually contains. It was a photograph. An old apartment building in East Bayside, the neighborhood just north of the old port that had been going through changes across the years. The kind of neighborhood that Portland has several of. Not wealthy, not destitute. The lived-in kind where working families and older residents and people in various stages of stability or instability exist in the specific proximity of a city that doesn't have room to sort everyone neatly. On the back of the photograph, in Margaret's handwriting, "Paid in full." I looked at my wife. She said, "There are people in that building who would not have a home today if I had listened to you 20 years ago." I set the photograph on the table. I did not say anything immediately, which is my way when I don't yet understand what I'm looking at. 40 years of maritime electrical work taught me that the most dangerous moment in any system is when you start making decisions before you've traced the full circuit. You identify the problem you can see, you assume it's the only problem, you fix it, and then the thing you didn't look for takes down the whole system 3 weeks later. I don't react until I understand. Margaret has always said that quality is maddening in an argument. I've always said it's what kept the boats I worked on from burning. I picked up the second envelope. Another photograph. A different building. This one in Woodford's Corner, a neighborhood I knew from driving through it for decades. Unremarkable from the outside. The kind of residential block that exists in every mid-sized American city, and that most people pass without registering. On the back, The third floor. 6 years. The third envelope contained paper, not a photograph. A folded sheet with a list of names. 15, maybe 18, with dates beside each one. Not amounts. Dates. I looked at Margaret. She was watching me with the quality of attention she brings to things she has decided to accept whatever comes. I said, "Sit down." "Tell me." She sat. And the story that came out across the next 2 hours, at the kitchen table in our house on Juniper Wharf Road, with the November dark outside and the smell of earlier cooking still in the air and the 3 envelopes between us, was not the story I expected to hear. Not remotely. Not in its architecture, not in its detail, not in its length, and certainly not in what it revealed about the woman I had been married to since I was 26 years old. I need to tell you about Margaret before I tell you what she told me. Because you cannot understand what she did, or why she did it, without understanding who she is. And who she is requires some history. Margaret grew up in a family of moderate and variable means. Her father worked for the railroad, a stable job until it wasn't, and her mother was a school secretary for 30 years, the same kind of work Margaret eventually did herself, which she always said was not coincidence but inheritance, the way certain skills and certain instincts pass through families without anyone formally teaching them. Her mother's name was Dorothy Hennessy, before she married. Margaret has spoken about her throughout our marriage with the specific combination of admiration and complexity that characterizes the way most people talk about the parent they are most like. Not the simple admiration of uncomplicated love, but the layered recognition of seeing yourself in someone else and having complicated feelings about what you see. Dorothy had a particular characteristic that Margaret described to me the first time, about 6 years into our marriage, on an evening when we were discussing something about a relative who had asked us for help with a bill. She said, "My mother never let anyone know she was helping them until the help was already done." I'd asked what she meant. She said her mother would figure out what someone needed and provide it in a way that the person receiving it could interpret as something other than charity if they needed to. She'd address a bill as if there'd been a miscalculation. She'd bring food as if she'd made too much. She'd loan money with terms so loose they were really a gift, but call them a loan so the person could maintain their own account of the transaction. I remembered thinking, when Margaret told me that it sounded like something between kindness and manipulation. I said so, Margaret said, or it sounds like understanding that some people can only receive help if it doesn't cost them their self-respect. We had not agreed on that point, even then. I thought the honest thing was to offer help plainly and let the person decide what to do with the offering. Margaret thought the honest thing was to understand what a person actually needed versus what they were capable of accepting. We were, I now understand, already living in the different philosophies that would define everything that came out on the kitchen table 20-some years later. But I didn't know it at the time. You rarely know in the early years which of your disagreements are cosmetic and which are structural. Margaret began working as a school office administrator when she was 24. She was good at it, exceptionally good, in the specific way of people whose intelligence finds its best expression in the management of complex systems with unpredictable human variables. A school office is, underneath all its bureaucratic appearance, a continuously operating triage center. She had a particular gift for identifying which problems were urgent and which were simply loud, and for addressing the urgent ones before they became crises. She carried that skill home. What I didn't know, what I was only beginning to understand as she talked that November evening, was that she had been applying that same triage intelligence to the extended family and the circle of people we'd known over the years for 21 years. Quietly, systematically, without telling me. She'd started, she said, after her mother died. Dorothy had spent the last 2 years of her life in circumstances that were more financially difficult than anyone in the family had fully known, partly because Dorothy had spent decades making it her practice to appear fine regardless of her actual situation. When she died, Margaret had gone through her papers and found evidence of difficulties she hadn't known existed. Small debts, postponed maintenance, the specific financial archaeology of a person who had spent their life caring for other people's problems while managing her own with a pride that sometimes crossed into stubbornness. Margaret had sat with those papers for a long time, and she had made a promise to herself, not to Dorothy's memory, not in the formal way of a vow. Margaret doesn't operate in formal gestures. She simply decided. She decided that if she ever had the ability to help someone in her family avoid the particular kind of difficulty Dorothy had faced, the difficulty of needing help and being unable to ask for it, she would help. Quietly. In the way that preserved what the person needed to preserve about themselves. She had not initially hidden this from me. She had tried, twice in the first year, to tell me about situations she was aware of in which family members were struggling. I had responded the way I respond to such situations, with analysis. I'd asked questions about how the situation had developed. I'd formed opinions about whose decisions had contributed to it. I'd calculated what assistance would mean for our own financial position. I'd expressed my assessment of whether the person had demonstrated the kind of behavior that made helping them a good use of resources. Margaret had listened to me both times, and both times she had decided that telling me was creating more problems than it was solving. Not because I was wrong, necessarily, in my analysis, but because my analysis was not what the person needed. My analysis was what I needed: the processing of a practical man who organizes risk into categories he can manage. And while I was processing, people who needed help in the next 30 days were waiting for it. So she stopped telling me. She'd had, across her years of part-time work and careful management of her own earnings, a separate account. Not secret in the sense of concealed from the record. It was her personal account, accessible to her, opened in her name, funded by income she'd earned herself. She had not, she was precise about this, taken money from our shared accounts without my knowledge. What she had done was redirect money she personally controlled toward purposes she had not disclosed to me. The distinction mattered to her. It mattered less to me at that kitchen table than she had hoped it would, because what I was hearing was not primarily the accounting. I'm a man who has worked with electrical systems for 40 years. I understand that the path the current takes is less important than what happens when the circuit is complete. And the circuit I was assembling, page by page and name by name and date by date, was a picture of my wife's inner life across 21 years that I had not been part of. A set of decisions, moral and practical, made consistently over 2 decades in the same house where I'd been sleeping and eating and conducting my own life, under the assumption that I knew the person I was doing it with. She placed the ledger on the table. It was an ordinary composition notebook, the black and white kind, the kind that school teachers and note-takers and people who record things they intend to keep have been using for decades. She opened it to the first page. The first entry was dated February, 21 years earlier. It said a name I recognized: her cousin, a woman who had been going through a difficult period that I remembered, vaguely, as a situation I had privately concluded was largely of that woman's own making. Beside the name, a date. Below the name, an amount. And beneath the amount, in Margaret's small, precise handwriting, she needed 6 months to start again. I turned the page. Another name. Another amount. Another sentence. He was too proud to ask. I turned the page. They were almost back on their feet. I turned the page. This should be the last time. I sat at the kitchen table in the house I'd lived in for 23 years with this notebook in my hands, and I turned page after page after page. The entries were not dramatic. They were not written with the self-congratulatory tone of someone recording their own generosity. They were written the way Margaret writes everything, with the spare, accurate language of someone who wants information preserved, not celebrated. But as I read, I began recognizing names. Not all of them. Some were people I didn't know well. Extended family connections at the edges of Margaret's larger circle. People whose names I'd heard at occasional gatherings across the years without ever attaching much particular history to. But others I knew. People I had formed opinions about. People I had, in conversations with Margaret across the years, described in terms that I was now reading against a different set of facts. A name I recognized as someone I'd characterized as financially irresponsible. The ledger said, lost the job when the company restructured. Needed 3 months. Paid back half before I told him he didn't have to. A name I recognized as someone Margaret had spent what I thought was excessive time helping after a difficult period. The ledger said, the apartment was becoming uninhabitable. Landlord refused repairs. She needed deposit and first month somewhere else. She found work the following autumn. A name that surprised me. Surprised me enough that I stopped turning pages. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at Margaret. She was watching me. She knew which page I'd reached. She'd known it was coming. The name was Thomas, Thomas Callahan, my brother. Thomas is 71 years old. He's younger than me by 8 years, which in a family like ours meant we were close in some respects and generationally distant in others. He'd spent his adult life in a different kind of work than mine. He'd tried to run a small marine supply business in the 90s that had eventually failed during a period when the industry was consolidating, and the small independent operators were being squeezed from two directions simultaneously. After it failed, Thomas had gone through a period of several years that I had privately interpreted, across those years and since, as a demonstration of the specific difficulties Thomas had always had with sustained discipline. I had not been generous in that interpretation. I could see at the kitchen table reading Margaret's ledger that I had not been generous. I had been applying my own framework, the framework of a man who had built his professional life on showing up completely and on time and doing the work correctly every single day regardless of circumstances, to a situation whose circumstances I had apparently not known at all. The ledger entry for Thomas was longer than most. It described a period that I had witnessed from the outside as Thomas simply struggling without resolution. What the ledger described was a specific sequence of events, specific problems, specific assistance, specific attempts to rebuild. It described Thomas applying for additional training to move into a different area of marine industry work. It described the time that required. It described assistance with expenses during that period. And at the bottom of the entry, in Margaret's handwriting, a sentence I kept reading. He asked me not to tell Richard because he was afraid Richard would think less of him. I told him Richard loves him. He said he knew that. He said that was why he didn't want Richard to see him this way. The November wind came off the water. The kitchen was quiet. I set the ledger on the table. I looked at my wife. She met my eyes with the expression she'd had when I came through the door. The expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for the carrying to be finished. I said, "How long?" She said, 21 years. I said, 21 years. She nodded. I said, "And you never thought I deserved to know?" She answered, without hesitation, without having to search for the words, "I thought you deserved to live without carrying everyone else's problems." I sat with that. Then I said, "You didn't spare me the problems. You spared me the truth." The kitchen was quiet for a long time after that. Outside, the November dark was complete. Somewhere out on the water, a boat horn sounded. The specific low tone of something large moving carefully in the channel, the sound I've been hearing from this house for 23 years, so familiar it usually doesn't register. That evening I heard it. The ledger was on the table between us. I looked at it. 21 years of entries. 21 years of names and dates and small, precise sentences that described, in the compressed language of someone who kept records but didn't want to keep them dramatically, the specific circumstances of people I had known and judged, and sometimes dismissed. And underneath all of it, underneath Thomas's entry and the apartment in East Bayside and every page I'd read, was a question I hadn't yet fully articulated, that was sitting somewhere in the space between my understanding of my marriage and the marriage I was now beginning to see. Not about the money, about the woman who had kept this ledger for 21 years, about who she had been in those years while I was living beside her and thinking I knew. About the difference between the Margaret I'd believed I understood and the Margaret who wrote, in her small, precise handwriting, beside a cousin's name and an amount and a date, she needed 6 months to start again. And about something else, something Margaret had said earlier that I kept returning to. She had said there are people in that building who would not have a home today if I had listened to you 20 years ago, if I had listened to you. Which meant she hadn't. Which meant she'd looked at my reasoning, the careful, calculated, practical reasoning of a man who organizes everything into what he can afford and what he can't, what is sustainable and what isn't. And she had listened to it and then done something different, not out of disrespect. The ledger was not written by a person who disrespects anyone. Every entry was careful. Every sentence was considered. Every decision it recorded had been weighed. She had done something different because she had seen something I hadn't seen. The question I needed to answer, the question I was going to spend the following days and weeks building toward, was whether she had been right. And a secondary question, quieter, but in some ways more important to me. There was a letter Margaret had written that she'd never given me. She told me about it near the end of that first conversation at the kitchen table. She said she'd written it years earlier, in the period when she was deciding whether to tell me what she'd been doing, and that she'd decided not to give it to me. She said it was still in the house. She said she would give it to me if I wanted it. I said I did. She didn't get up to retrieve it that evening. She said it could wait for morning, that we'd talked enough for one night, that some things needed to be slept on before they were continued. I didn't argue with that. We went to bed in the house on Juniper Wharf Road, Margaret and I, the way we'd been going to bed in this house for 23 years. And I lay awake listening to the water and thinking about 21 years of entries in a composition notebook, and a letter I hadn't read yet that my wife had written and then decided I wasn't ready for. I thought about Thomas, about the sentence he was afraid Richard would think less of him, about what it meant that my brother had spent years rebuilding his life in a way I'd never been told about, and had specifically asked the person who helped him not to tell me, because he was afraid of my opinion of him. I lay in the dark and thought about what kind of man his brother had been, for Thomas to have needed to keep that secret. The letter was on the kitchen table the next morning. Margaret had set it there before I came downstairs. She was at the stove. She didn't say anything when I came in. She let me pour my coffee, let me sit, let me see the envelope at my place at the table in the particular morning light of a November kitchen in Portland, Maine. I picked it up. What I read changed the shape of everything that had come before and everything that would come after. But what changed it most was not the explanation Margaret had written. It was a single sentence near the end of the letter, a sentence she had written when she was deciding whether to tell me what she'd been doing, and that she had decided, at the time, was too true to say out loud. I read it twice. Then I folded the letter, set it on the table, looked out the kitchen window at the November light on the water, and understood for the first time that the marriage I had believed I was living was not the only marriage that had been happening. The letter was 4 pages. Margaret writes the way she thinks, in complete sentences, without revision marks, without the evidence of second-guessing that most people leave behind when they write something difficult. She'd always been that way. When she wrote something down, it was because she'd already done the thinking elsewhere, in the private space of her own processing, and what appeared on the page was the conclusion rather than the working. Reading her letters was always like being handed the answer to a problem you hadn't yet seen the equation for. This one was no different. She began by explaining what I already knew from the previous evening. The starting point, her mother Dorothy, the papers after Dorothy died, the promise she'd made to herself. She wrote it not to repeat what she'd told me, but to give it context, to establish, before anything else, that the origin of what she'd been doing was not impulsive, not the result of a single emotional moment that she'd then sustained out of momentum. It had been a decision, a considered, deliberate, renewed decision, made again each time she acted on it. She wrote about the first 2 conversations we'd had, the ones I'd remembered vaguely, the attempts in the early years to involve me that had ended in what she described as my systematic deconstruction of the situation. She was not unkind about it. She wrote, "You are the person I most trust in the world, and when you analyze something, you do it completely. But completeness takes time, and sometimes the time analysis requires is longer than the situation allows. And sometimes, when someone is already ashamed of needing help, a thorough examination of how they arrived at needing it is worse than no help at all." I read that paragraph slowly. Then I read it again. She was describing something I recognized in myself without having ever quite named it. The way I processed risk. The way I understood responsibility. I had spent 40 years working on electrical systems where incomplete analysis was the precondition for disaster, where the failure to trace the full circuit before acting could result in something catastrophic. That habit of mind was real, and it was professional, and it had served me well in every context where the thing I was analyzing was a system rather than a person. Margaret was suggesting, with the characteristic precision that made her both easy and difficult to argue with, that people were not systems. That the same thoroughness that prevented electrical fires was not automatically applicable to a cousin who had lost her apartment. I didn't fully agree with that. I want to be honest about that. There was a part of me, reading the letter at the kitchen table, that wanted to push back, to say that the same discipline that made me careful with electricity was what had given us a financially stable life. and that without it, we wouldn't have had the resources Margaret had been redirecting for 21 years. The foundation of our security was, in some meaningful part, built from the conservatism she was criticizing, but I also recognized that the criticism was accurate, and that being accurate and being the complete picture were not the same thing. She moved, in the third paragraph, to what she called her system. She used that word deliberately. I recognized it immediately because it's not a word Margaret uses loosely. She said she had developed a system because the alternative was making decisions case by case without principles. And she didn't trust her own compassion as a sole guide. Compassion, she wrote, is real, but it is also susceptible to the wrong kind of influence, to volume, to urgency, to the particular persuasiveness of people who ask well. She wanted to help people who needed it rather than people who asked loudest, so she had established criteria. She would help only when she believed the situation was temporary, when she could identify a plausible path from crisis to stability that the assistance would enable. She would help only when the person's situation was the result of circumstances rather than sustained patterns she could not see a way through. She would not help someone stay in a bad situation. She would help someone reach a better one. She wrote, "I was wrong sometimes. I helped people who did not become independent the way I hoped. I helped people who needed more help than one person could provide, and I could not give it." Those entries in the ledger are the ones that I still think about. But I also helped people who did exactly what I hoped, who used a small amount of time and security to make decisions they couldn't have made in panic, and who are now the people making those decisions for their own lives. I believe more of the entries are the second kind than the first. I thought about the names I'd recognized, the woman I'd characterized as financially irresponsible, 3 months and she'd found work, the relative who'd needed a new apartment, the following autumn employment, entry after entry of people I had watched from the outside through the lens of my own framework and had assessed as examples of various kinds of failure. And behind each of those assessments, apparently, was a fuller picture I hadn't had access to because I hadn't been given it. Then I reached the sentence near the end, the sentence Margaret had written when she was deciding whether to give me the letter, and had decided was too true to say out loud, and had kept for years instead. She had written, "I know you would help them too. I just don't know if you would let them keep their pride while doing it." I set the letter down, looked at the kitchen window. The November light on Casco Bay was the particular quality it gets on cold, clear mornings, flat and silver, very direct, without the warmth that makes coastal light comfortable in other seasons. The kind of light that shows you things accurately rather than flatteringly. I sat with that sentence for a long time, because it was not an accusation of cruelty. I want to be clear about that, because my first response, the defensive response, the response of a man whose integrity is important to him and who has just read something that challenges his picture of himself, was to frame it as one, to hear it as Margaret saying, "You would help them, but you would make them feel bad about it." But that wasn't what she'd written. She'd written something more specific and more honest than that. She'd written that she didn't know. She hadn't concluded that I would strip people of their dignity in the process of assisting them. She'd written that she wasn't certain I wouldn't, and across 21 years, she had resolved that uncertainty by not finding out, by carrying the full weight of the decision herself, rather than introducing an unknown into a situation where the stakes, other people's dignity, other people's ability to recover, felt too high for uncertainty. That was the part that sat hardest. Not that she'd doubted me, that she'd resolved the doubt by deciding alone. Margaret came in with a second cup of coffee and set it beside mine without being asked. She sat down across the table. She looked at the letter, which I'd folded and set between us. She waited. This is one of the things I have always valued in Margaret, her ability to wait. She is not a woman who fills silence with noise because silence makes her uncomfortable. She sits in it the way a person sits in a room they belong in. I said, "You trusted yourself more than you trusted me." She answered immediately, without having to think about it, which told me she'd anticipated the question. She said, "No, I trusted you enough to believe you'd forgive me once you understood." I said, "That's not the same thing." She said, "I know." The kitchen was very quiet. Then I said, 21 years, Margaret." She nodded. "That's not a decision," I said. That's a separate life. She looked at me. Not defensively. She doesn't defend herself with deflection or offense. She looked at me the way she looks at everything she's decided to accept. Yes, she said. In some ways it was. I picked up the letter, looked at the sentence again. Then I said, "Tell me about Thomas." She told me. What she told me about my brother filled in the spaces of a period I had witnessed from the outside with what I now understood was a significant deficiency of information. Thomas's business had failed in a way I'd always understood to be the result of poor decisions compounded by stubbornness, a characterization that Margaret's account made clear was partially accurate and substantially incomplete. The marine supply industry in the late 90s had consolidated rapidly. Larger distributors with access to the pricing that volume purchasing enabled had undercut smaller independent operations across the coast with a speed and completeness that hadn't been entirely predictable, and that left operators like Thomas with a narrowing margin that no amount of good decisions could have fully compensated for. He had made some poor decisions, that was true, and Margaret didn't minimize it, but he had also been caught in a structural change in his industry that would have required resources to navigate that he didn't have, and that nobody had offered him in time. He had been, during the period I remembered as Thomas simply struggling, attempting to retrain for different work in the marine sector. The retraining had taken time and money. He had not had enough of either. Margaret had provided the money, and she had told Thomas, at the time, that he didn't have to tell me. She said, "He wanted to tell you. Several times he told me he wanted to. I talked him out of it." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I knew that if he told you, you would help him. And I knew how you would help him. You would have taken the situation completely in hand. You would have organized it and managed it and found the most efficient solution. And Thomas would have received exactly what he needed financially and would have felt for the rest of his life like a problem his older brother solved." I sat with that. "He needed you to see him as a person who fixed his own problem," she said. "Not as a problem you fixed," I said, "and my opinion of whether he fixed it wouldn't count, because I'd have known the whole time that you helped him." "Yes. So you decided to protect my brother's dignity from me." "I decided to protect your relationship with your brother," she said, "which I thought was more valuable than me having to carry the secret alone." That distinction between the object of the protection and the cost of providing it was the kind of precision Margaret brings to things that made me simultaneously respect and resent the reasoning. She had not protected Thomas from me because she thought I was dangerous. She had protected the relationship between us from a dynamic that would have changed it permanently. She had been, she believed, doing me a favor. I wasn't certain yet whether she was right. Here is what I want to say to anyone listening to this story, because I think it matters to the parts that come next. I spent several days after reading the letter in a state that I can only describe as a kind of reckoning. Not dramatic, not acute in the way that the word reckoning sometimes implies, but sustained. The specific condition of a person who has been shown that a version of reality they believed was complete had, in fact, significant material in it they hadn't accounted for. I had built my life on the principle that responsible love meant planning carefully and providing reliably and ensuring that the people you were responsible for never faced a crisis you hadn't prepared for. I had believed, without ever quite stating it as a belief because it was simply the water I swam in, that this approach was not only practical, but moral. That the discipline required to maintain financial security was itself a form of care, and that departing from it in favor of the messy unpredictability of continuous family assistance was not generosity, but a lack of system. Margaret had built her life, simultaneously and in the same house, on a completely different principle. She had believed that responsible love sometimes meant accepting that crises happen to people regardless of their planning, and that what people in crisis need most is not a judgment of how they arrived there, but a specific and dignified form of help that allows them to leave. Neither of us had been having the same marriage. We had been having two marriages that were housed in the same life. That realization, across those days, produced something I hadn't expected, not anger, or not primarily anger, something more like grief. For the years of conversations we hadn't had, for the arguments about family assistance that had stayed in the shallows because Margaret had stopped bringing the depths of the situation to the surface. For the version of my wife I had known, which was real and complete in certain ways and entirely absent in others. And for something else. For the picture of myself I was having to revise. If you've ever been listening to something, really listening, in the way that changes what you thought you understood about yourself, stay with this story. Because what I found in the ledger, and in Margaret's letter, and in the conversations that followed, was not comfortable. And I think the uncomfortable parts are the parts worth hearing. I called Thomas on a Wednesday, not to confront him. I want to be careful about that word, because it implies an adversarial energy that wasn't what I was carrying. I called him because after days of reading Margaret's ledger and thinking about what it meant, the person I needed to speak to most was my brother. He answered on the third ring. His voice. I know Thomas's voice as well as any voice I know. 8 years of living with someone puts something in you that doesn't leave. Had the particular quality of a man who has been expecting a call he didn't know when to expect. He said, "Rick." I said. I read the ledger. A pause. A long one. The specific pause of someone calculating how much was contained in a sentence and what to do with it. He said, "How much did you read?" "All of it," I said. Another pause. Then he said, "I wanted to tell you." "I know," I said. "Margaret told me." "She talked you out of being angry at me?" "She explained why you asked her not to." He was quiet. I said, "I need to ask you something, Tom, and I need you to answer honestly." "All right. Were you afraid I'd help you the wrong way? Or were you afraid I'd refuse?" The pause this time was the longest yet. When Thomas finally answered, his voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him since we were much younger. Not vulnerable exactly, but open in a way that adult men between whom certain habits of reserve have developed don't usually allow. He said, "I was afraid you'd help me, and I'd never stop knowing that you had to." I sat with that sentence in the way that sentences that are entirely true and entirely painful require you to sit. "That I'd have to," I said. "That it would be a problem you were solving because problems like that get solved," he said. "Not because—" He stopped. "Not because you saw me as someone worth helping." "Tom, I know that's not—" "Listen to me," I said. "You are my brother. Everything I have has always been partly yours to call on. Every year of my life." He was quiet. "I didn't know how to say that," I said. "I don't think I ever told you that directly. And if I'd known, if Margaret had told me, I don't know that I would have said it the right way. I might have made it about the logistics, about the plan. I might have—" I stopped, because I was, in the middle of the sentence, arriving at something I hadn't quite reached before. I might have made it about the problem instead of about you. I didn't say that out loud. Not yet. But I held it. Thomas said, "Margaret said you'd understand eventually." "She was more confident than I deserved," I said. He almost laughed. "She usually is." We talked for about an hour, not about the money. I didn't want the conversation to be about the money, because the money was the mechanism and not the thing, and Thomas already knew that better than most people. We talked about the years of the business, about what the industry had been doing and what it had done to operators his size, about the retraining, about the period after when things had gradually stabilized and he'd found a way forward that he could maintain. He said, "I've thought about telling you 100 times. Why didn't you?" "Because it was over," he said, "and I didn't know how to bring it up without it becoming the main thing between us, without every conversation for the next 10 years being in the shadow of it. Instead, every conversation was in the shadow of you not telling me," I said. A pause. "Yeah," he said. "I've thought about that too." I want to stop here and say something to anyone who recognizes what I'm describing. Not from this specific story, from the pattern of it. The way people who love each other sometimes make the same kind of mistake from completely different directions. Thomas protecting our relationship by staying silent. Margaret protecting my brother and me by carrying the secret herself. Me, unknowingly, creating a dynamic where the people around me calculated the cost of my knowing before deciding whether to tell me. Nobody in that calculation was wrong about their love. Everyone was wrong about their methods. That distinction took me weeks to fully arrive at. It didn't come all at once. It came the way understanding usually comes, gradually, in the spaces between other things, during the particular quiet of early morning in a house on Juniper Wharf Road, when the water was just becoming visible in the light and the day hadn't yet organized itself into its demands. I went, in those weeks, to talk to some of the people in the ledger. Not all of them. Several I didn't know well enough to approach without making the visit something stranger than I intended. But a few, the ones I'd had regular contact with over the years, the ones whose presence in the ledger had surprised me most, I went to see. I went to see Margaret's cousin Patricia, the first entry in the ledger. The woman I'd characterized as financially irresponsible. She was living in a rented house on the east side of the city, working in the office of a healthcare services company, with the organized, maintained quality of a person who has built her life with deliberate attention. She made coffee. She looked at me across the kitchen table with the particular expression of someone who has known a visit like this was eventually coming and has thought about how they feel about it. She said, "Margaret told you." I said, "Not exactly. I found it." She said, "Is she all right?" I told her yes. That Margaret was fine. That the conversation had been difficult and ongoing, but that it wasn't a crisis. Patricia nodded. She said, "What do you want to know?" I said, "What happened? In your own words, not through the ledger." She told me. What she told me was not dramatically different from what the ledger entry suggested. She had lost a job in a restructuring, had found herself in a situation where the resources available to her were insufficient for the transition, had accepted Margaret's help under terms she described as unusually respectful. She said, "Your wife didn't make me feel like a charity case." I said, "How did she make you feel?" Patricia thought about it. Like someone who had a temporary problem that a specific amount of assistance would resolve. She was very clear about that framing. She said, "You have a problem that money can help. I have some money that can help. This is not a reflection of anything except mathematics and timing." I sat with that. "Mathematics and timing," I said. She said the rest of it, the judgment about how I'd gotten there and whether I'd learned from it, was my business and not hers. She said her business was whether I could move forward from it. I thought about what Margaret had written in the letter, about helping someone reach a better situation rather than keeping them in a worse one, about the difference between the problem and the person. Patricia said, "I've thought about it a lot over the years. Why it didn't feel like charity. I think it was because she was genuinely uninterested in being thanked. She wasn't doing it to feel like someone who helps people. She was doing it because she'd looked at the situation and identified what would make it better. Like," she paused, "like a repair. A repair." I looked out her kitchen window. 40 years of electrical work. 40 years of identifying the problem, understanding the system, providing the specific intervention that would restore function. Not a performance of fixing. Not doing it to be seen as the person who fixed it. The work itself, done correctly, without ceremony. I went home that evening and sat in the kitchen. Margaret was reading in the other room. I could hear the particular quiet of it. The specific quality of a house where someone is reading. The occasional shift of position. The silence that is not empty because it contains someone's full attention directed elsewhere. I thought about the ledger. About 21 years of entries in a composition notebook. About the difference between what I had seen for 21 years and what had been happening. And then about something I hadn't yet fully addressed. Something in the back of the ledger. I'd seen it briefly the first night but hadn't fully processed it. The final entries, the most recent ones, pages I'd looked at quickly and moved past. I went to the study where I'd put the ledger after the first evening and I took it out. I found the most recent page. I read it. Then I sat very still. Because the most recent entry was not about a family member I'd known about. Not about a cousin or a neighbor or anyone from the circle of names I'd been mentally mapping across the past weeks. The most recent entry was about a situation I recognized. A situation I had known about. A situation in which I had formed a clear and confident opinion. And what the ledger entry described in Margaret's small, precise handwriting was not the situation I had understood. Not remotely. And the date of the entry was 4 months ago, which meant it was still in progress. Which meant whatever it was, Margaret was still carrying it. And hadn't told me. I read the entry 3 times, not because it was long. It wasn't. It was about the same length as most of the others, Margaret's characteristic compression at work, the minimum words required to record the maximum information. I read it 3 times because the first time I was reading for the facts, and the second time I was reading for what I had missed, and the third time I was reading to be sure I understood what the combination of those two things meant. The name in the entry was Frank Delaney. Frank is 68 years old. He worked with me on the waterfront for about 12 years before he moved into harbor management, a transition that suited him better than the electrical work had. Frank's mind operates in logistics and coordination rather than in the precise technical detail that electricians require, and harbor management gave him a context where those strengths were useful. We had stayed in loose contact across the years since he left the waterfront work. The kind of contact that older professional friendships maintain. Occasional phone calls, running into each other at the marine supply place on Commercial Street. The particular greeting of men who shared significant years of work without having developed the friendship that would have made them close outside of it. About 8 months ago, I had seen Frank at the supply place. He had looked, I thought at the time, tired in a way that wasn't purely physical. We'd talked for 10 minutes near the engine parts aisle, and he'd mentioned in passing that things had been difficult since his wife had become seriously ill the previous year. He said it in the way men of his generation mention serious things, briefly, without dwelling, in a tone that communicated the weight without inviting extended discussion. I had responded the way I respond to such things. I had said I was sorry to hear it. I had asked if there was anything I could do. He had said he was managing. I had said to let me know if anything changed. We had concluded the conversation and gone our separate ways. I had come home that evening and told Margaret about running into Frank. I had described him as managing because that was what he'd said. I had said, somewhere in the recounting, that I thought Frank had always been better at the logistics side than the financial discipline side, and that I hoped he had made arrangements for situations like the one he was in. I had not said this cruelly. I want to be clear about that, because I am being honest about what I said, and honesty requires me to be accurate about my intentions as well as my words. I wasn't dismissing Frank. I was expressing, in the way I express concern about people I care about in some measure, a worry about whether he had the structural foundation to handle what was coming. Margaret had listened. She had said something brief and had changed the subject. And 4 months ago, based on the ledger entry, she had made a specific contribution to a specific situation involving Frank Delaney that she had not told me about. The entry read, Frank came through Patricia. He needed 3 months while June's medical situation stabilized enough for him to return to part-time work. He was too far behind on the house payments to catch up alone. He didn't ask directly. Patricia mentioned it and I called him. He cried on the phone. First time in 68 years he'd accepted help from anyone who wasn't family. He said he didn't know how to do it. I told him he was doing it right now. And below that, 2 lines. Richard mentioned Frank at dinner in March. He said he hoped Frank had planned ahead. He hasn't told Frank he said that. Frank hasn't told Richard he needed help. This one I'll carry alone. I sat in the study with the ledger for a long time. The house was quiet around me. Margaret was still in the other room. The lamp beside her reading chair was the only light on in that part of the house, and it cast a specific warmth into the hallway that I could see from where I was sitting. That warmth of a house inhabited by a person doing something quiet and private. I thought about Frank Delaney on the phone, crying. I thought about Margaret telling him he was doing it right now. And I thought about what I'd said at dinner in March, said at a dinner table in my own house, to my own wife, not intending it as a judgment of Frank precisely, but saying it in the particular mode of the man who organizes things, and measures things, and worries about whether other people have organized and measured their own things sufficiently. He said he hoped Frank had planned ahead, and Margaret had sat across from me and listened to that sentence, and said something brief and changed the subject, because she already knew that Frank hadn't planned ahead, in the sense that no plan is fully adequate for an extended and serious illness, and because she had already, or was about to, provide the specific kind of help she believed the situation required. And she had decided, and written it down in the ledger, which was her form of honesty with herself even when she couldn't be fully honest with me, that this one she would carry alone. Because I had given her reason to believe I would not have helped Frank Delaney in the way Frank Delaney needed to be helped. I closed the ledger. I went to the kitchen, filled the kettle, set it on the stove, stood there in the kitchen of the house on Juniper Wharf Road while the water heated, in the particular quality of a November evening that had gone fully dark outside the window, and I worked through what I needed to say. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway about 10 minutes later. She'd heard me moving around. She looked at the ledger in my hand. I'd brought it with me without thinking about it. And she looked at my face, and she did the thing she does when she's reading a situation. She went still and waited. I said, "Frank Delaney." She didn't look away. "4 months ago," I said. She said, "Yes." I set the ledger on the table, sat down. She came and sat across from me, the way she had the first evening, with the particular composure of a woman who has decided to accept whatever is coming. I said, "You heard me say what I said at dinner in March." "Yes." "And you were already helping him, or about to." "I called him the following week," she said. "And you didn't tell me because you thought I'd—" "What exactly? Object? Moralize? Calculate whether he'd planned adequately?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I thought you'd remember what you said at dinner. And I thought that if you knew you'd said it and then you knew I'd helped him anyway, it would create something between you and Frank that he didn't deserve." I looked at her. "You were protecting Frank from me again," I said. "I was protecting your friendship with Frank," she said. "There's a difference." "You keep making that distinction," I said. "Because it's real," she said. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Is it still ongoing? The assistance?" "He's back to part-time work," she said. "Another month, probably. Maybe 6 weeks." I nodded. Then I said the thing I'd been working toward since I'd sat in the study reading the entry. I said, "I want to call Frank." Margaret looked at me carefully. "Why?" "Because he's 68 years old and his wife is seriously ill and he cried on the phone to you about accepting help and I've known him for 25 years and he doesn't know that." I paused. Not to tell him I know about the money, just to be his friend, in whatever way I know how to be. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You'd do that without telling him why?" "Yes." She looked at the ledger, then at me. "Richard." "What?" "That's exactly what I've been trying to do for 21 years, she said. The kettle began to sound. I got up and poured the water, made 2 cups, set them on the table, sat back down. The kitchen was very quiet. I said, "I know." Then, "I just went about it differently." "Yes," she said. "Alone," I said. "Yes." I looked at my cup, then at her. "That's what I want to change." She looked at me. "Not what you're doing," I said. "Not who you help or how you help them or the philosophy behind any of it. You were right about more of it than I want to immediately admit. And I'll tell you that in more detail when I've finished being a man who doesn't like admitting things." She almost smiled. "What I want to change is the alone part." She waited. "I don't want you to stop helping people," I said. "I want you to stop believing you have to hide it from me." She said, "Even when you disagree?" I said, "Especially then." That sentence had been inside me since I'd read the letter. Since the sentence about whether I would let people keep their pride while I was helping them. Since the call with Thomas when he'd said he was afraid the help would be a problem I solved rather than a person I saw. It had been building across weeks of reading and visiting and thinking, and it arrived at the kitchen table with more certainty than I usually bring to anything that isn't a technical problem. Margaret looked at me across the table. She said, "I wrote in the letter that I wasn't sure you could do it." "I know," I said. "That's the part I've been thinking about most." "And?" I looked at the ledger between us, at 21 years of entries in her handwriting, at the names I'd recognized and the sentences I'd read and the people I'd visited, and the conversation with Thomas and Frank's name in the most recent pages. I said, "I think you were right to be unsure. I think I would have done it wrong, probably, in some of the cases. I might have made it about the money when it needed to be about the person. I might have asked the wrong questions. I might have taken over when what was needed was to step back." I paused. "But I think I would have learned. If you'd given me the chance to learn, I would have gotten better at it." Margaret was very still. "I didn't learn," I said, "because you didn't show me there was something to learn. You solved the problem before I knew it was a problem, and the solution included keeping me in the category of people you protected from difficulty." I looked at her directly. "I am your husband, Margaret. I am not one of your cases." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the most accurate thing you've said since the night I showed you the envelopes." "I know," I said. "I've been working up to it." She reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Not dramatically. Margaret doesn't do dramatic gestures. The ordinary gesture of a woman who has been married to a man for 53 years and is acknowledging that something true has just been said between them. I want to stop here and speak directly to the people listening to this story. Because there's something in what happened at that kitchen table that I think matters beyond the specific circumstances of Richard and Margaret Callahan. What we had been doing, both of us, in different directions, was loving each other by taking things away from each other. Margaret had taken away my knowledge, my involvement, my chance to make mistakes and learn from them, in order to spare me from worry and complexity. And I had taken away, without knowing I was doing it, the conditions under which she could tell me things, by being the kind of man whose analysis of a situation made the telling of it feel more costly than carrying it alone. We were both protecting. Neither of us had asked the other what kind of protection they actually wanted. That's not a story about money. It's not a story about secret accounts or family assistance or any of the specifics that made up the content of 21 years of ledger entries. It's a story about two people who confused managing someone's experience of love with the love itself. If you know what that confusion feels like, from either side, this part of the story is for you. What happened in the months after the kitchen table conversation was not a dramatic transformation. I want to be accurate about that, because I think accuracy matters more here than a satisfying narrative arc. We were in our late 70s. The habits of 53 years don't restructure themselves in response to a single honest conversation, however important that conversation is. What they do is begin to shift, slightly, in the direction of something better. We established, after several further conversations across several weeks, what Margaret called a principle, and I called a system, and what was in practice simply an agreement. Significant decisions about family assistance would be discussed before they were made. Not because Margaret needed my permission, not because I needed control of something that was properly hers to control, but because we had both agreed that secrecy had cost us something we couldn't fully calculate and didn't want to keep paying. There would be disagreements. We both knew that. I would sometimes think an intervention was inadvisable and she would make it anyway, and I would have to work through my feelings about that without making them her problem. She would sometimes want to help in a way that I would think was counterproductive, and she would have to be willing to hear that assessment even when she didn't agree with it. We were not making a perfect system. We were making a shared one. The distinction I had learned from 53 years of marriage and a composition notebook full of entries was more important than the perfection. I called Frank Delaney on a Thursday morning. I called him without mentioning the ledger, without mentioning Margaret's assistance, without giving any indication that I knew anything beyond what he had told me in the marine supply place 8 months earlier, which was that he was managing. I said I'd been thinking about him since we'd run into each other, that I hadn't followed up the way I should have, that I was calling to ask how things actually were, not in the way of a passing conversation, but in the way of someone who had time to listen. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me. He told me about the months after his wife June's diagnosis, about the specific and relentless logistics of serious illness in a household built for 2 working people, about the financial pressure that had accumulated with a speed he hadn't anticipated and hadn't had the reserves to fully absorb, about asking for help for the first time in his adult life and what that had felt like. He didn't tell me who had helped him. He told me the rest of it, with the specificity of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has been asked, sincerely, to put it down. I listened. Without analysis, without calculation, without the processing mode that Margaret had described in her letter. I listened the way I should have listened in the marine supply place 8 months earlier, if I'd known then what I knew now. At the end, Frank said, "I didn't think you'd want to hear all of that." I said, "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "You always seemed like someone who had everything arranged," he said. "I didn't want you to think I hadn't." I thought about what Thomas had said, that he was afraid I'd help him, and he'd never stop knowing that he had to. That he was afraid it would be a problem I was solving because problems like that get solved. I said, "Frank, I have spent most of my life being the person who seemed like he had everything arranged. I've recently learned that this was less of an achievement than I thought." He made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh that wasn't quite ready to be one. I said, "June's situation, How is she right now? He told me. Not fully recovered, but stabilized in the way that allows a life to be partially resumed. Still requiring significant management, but the acute phase had passed. He was back to part-time hours at the harbor. Things were, if not comfortable, at least navigable. I said, if you need anything, I mean that as specifically as I'm capable of meaning anything, call me. He said, Rick, I mean it. A pause. Then, I know you do. He called me 3 weeks later. Not in crisis. He wasn't calling for assistance. He was calling to tell me that June had had a good week, that she'd been out of the house twice. That something about the particular quality of a good week after a long, difficult stretch made him want to tell someone who would understand why a good week was what it was. I understood. We talked for 40 minutes. Somewhere in the middle of the conversation, he mentioned that he'd had some help during the worst of it. He didn't say who. He didn't say how. He said someone had provided a specific and dignified form of assistance that had made it possible for him to get through a period that he wasn't sure he could have gotten through otherwise. He said, I used to think asking for help meant you'd failed at the planning. I said, I know that feeling. I don't think that anymore, he said. No, I said. I don't either. Margaret was in the garden when I hung up. Late autumn in coastal Maine allows for a certain amount of garden work if you're willing to be cold, and Margaret is always willing to be cold if there's something useful to be done. I went out and stood beside her. She was working on the beds along the back fence, the ones she tends with the same patient attention she brings to everything she considers worth maintaining. She looked up. I said, Frank called. She said, Is he all right? He's better, I said. June had a good week. He wanted to tell someone. She nodded. Went back to the garden. I stood there for a moment. Then I said, He mentioned the help he received. Without saying who. She kept working. I said, He said he used to think asking for help meant he'd failed at the planning. She was quiet. I said, I told him I knew that feeling. She looked up then. I said, I've been thinking about what you wrote in the letter. The sentence about not knowing whether I would let people keep their pride. She waited. I think I would have, I said. I think I would have gotten it wrong in the specific ways you were afraid I would, and I think I would have had to learn from those mistakes, and I think, if you'd given me the time and the mistakes, I would have learned. She looked at me. But you didn't give me that time, I said. And I understand why. And I'm not asking you to apologize for the reasoning, because the reasoning was sound in the way that reasoning from incomplete information is sound. I paused. I'm just telling you what I believe about myself that I didn't know before the envelopes on the table. She said, What do you believe? I said, That I'm a man who can learn to do things he doesn't yet know how to do. I've been doing it my whole life, just usually with electrical systems. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, I should have trusted you with the learning. Yes, I said. You should have. I was afraid of what you'd damage while you were learning. I know, I said. But Margaret, you also damaged things. By not trusting me. Different things, but real ones. She nodded. I know, she said. We stood in the garden in the November cold, my wife and I, with 53 years of marriage between us and a ledger in the study, and 3 envelopes on the table in the first days of a different understanding of each other. Then she said, I want to show you something. She went inside, came back with the ledger and a pen. She opened to a new page. She wrote at the top, going forward. She dated it. Then she handed me the pen. I looked at her. She said, You write the first one. I thought about Frank, about Thomas, about the apartment building in East Bayside and the entry about Patricia, and she needed 6 months to start again. I thought about all the people in those pages and the sentences Margaret had written beside their names, and I thought about what a man who was learning to do something new might write in the ledger of a life he was just beginning to fully see. I wrote, Frank Delaney, June is having a good week, not an amount, not a date, just that. Margaret looked at it. Then she smiled. The specific smile of a woman who has been waiting for something and has just seen it arrive in a form she hadn't predicted and is more pleased with than she expected. She took the pen back. She wrote, beneath my entry, That's a beginning. Months later, after what had been enough time for certain things to settle and others to shift and the whole of it to take on the quality of something lived through rather than something survived, I gathered the adults from the ledger. Not all of them. The ones I knew and the ones who were willing. The ones for whom coming together in a room wouldn't create more awkwardness than it resolved. Thomas came. Patricia came. The woman who had rebuilt the small repair business came. Her name was Diane, and she had a quality of settled confidence that was entirely convincing, and that I recognized, looking at her, as the quality Margaret's ledger entries had been describing when they said they were almost back on their feet. I didn't prepare a speech. I said, "For years, I thought my wife was keeping secrets from me because she didn't trust me." They all knew parts of this story. None of them knew all of it. They sat with the partial knowledge that each of them had and listened. I said, "Now I think she was trying too hard to protect everyone." I looked at Margaret across the room. She met my eyes the way she always meets my eyes, directly, without deflection, with the full attention of a woman who considers looking away from important things a form of dishonesty. I said, "I don't want any of you to feel indebted to us. If you received help, use what it gave you. Don't spend your life repaying the money. Repay it by becoming the person who can help someone else someday." The room was quiet in the specific way of people who have just heard something accurate. Thomas said after a moment, "Rick." I looked at my brother. He said, "Thank you for calling me." I said, "I should have called you differently years ago." He said, "Maybe, but this one worked." That evening, late, Margaret and I sat at the kitchen table. The ledger was on the table. It had been on the table a lot in recent months. No longer hidden, no longer something she maintained in the private space of her own keeping. It was simply a record of something real, of years of decisions made with care and maintained with discipline and recorded with the accuracy of a woman who believed in being honest with herself, even when circumstances made being honest with everyone else too complicated. Margaret asked, "Are you still angry?" I looked at the ledger, then at her. "A little," I said. She nodded. "Fair enough." I took her hand. Her hand. I have held this hand for 53 years, and it is as familiar to me as any physical fact of my life. More familiar than my own tools, more recognizable than any material I've ever worked with. The specific weight of it. The particular way she allows her hand to settle in mine when she has decided the conversation has reached a point worth resting in. I said, "But I'm more grateful than angry." She asked, "For what?" I looked at the ledger, then at her. I said, "For making me realize that I spent half my life counting what we could afford, and you spent yours noticing what people could become." She smiled. Not the organized smile of a woman managing a moment. The real one. The one that comes from somewhere that doesn't get managed. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I looked toward the kitchen window. The dark November water was out there beyond the road. I couldn't see it, but I knew it. The way you know the things that have been present for long enough to become part of your understanding of where you are. I had entered this story, believing I had discovered how much money my wife had given away. I had expected to find, in a composition notebook full of her handwriting, the accounting of a secret that would explain a financial discrepancy and a 21-year silence. What I had found instead was a portrait, not of Margaret's generosity, though that was real and substantial, and I would spend the remaining years of my life understanding it more fully than I had. Not of the people in the ledger, though their names and their circumstances and the short sentences written beside them were as humanizing as anything I'd encountered in 7 decades of knowing people. What I had found was a portrait of how differently two people who love each other can see the world. How completely and genuinely they can share a life while privately holding different definitions of what that life should be for. How they can both be right in certain respects and wrong in others, and how the wrongness doesn't cancel the love and the love doesn't cancel the wrongness. And how sometimes the longest marriages are not the ones where two people were always identical, but the ones where they made enough room, year after year, for the parts of each other they did not completely understand. I thought I had opened a hidden ledger and found everything my wife had taken from our family. In the end, I found something else entirely. All the lives she had quietly helped stand back up. And the kind of man I was still capable of becoming at 79, if I was willing to learn. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever been in a marriage where two people were carrying different truths in the same house, or if you've ever been the one who loved someone by protecting them from something they might have needed to know, leave a comment below. Tell me which part of Richard and Margaret's story you recognized. Tell me about the ledger in your own life, the things you've been carrying alone because you decided it was better that way. Tell me about the moment you realized the person beside you had been keeping a promise you didn't know they'd made. This channel exists for stories that are true in the way that matters. Not in their specific facts, but in their emotional architecture. The kind of stories that make you feel less alone in the complicated interior of a life spent loving people and sometimes getting it wrong. If that's what you're looking for, subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you're there when the next story arrives. Every story I bring you is built the way Margaret kept her ledger, with honesty, with care for the specific detail, with respect for the dignity of everyone in it. I'll see you in the next one.